The Billionaire's motorcade stopped at a diner it had no reason to stop at, 3 black Suburbans easing off St. Claude and halting on Delary Street in front of the blue plate, because the man in the middle car had told his driver to stop. There was no meeting here. Nothing on the schedule until the groundbreaking at 10. The driver checked the mirror twice, because you do not just stop a motorcade on a residential block in the lower 9th. But the man in the back was already looking through the window of the blue plate, and he had gone very still. Inside, a waitress had just slid a plate across the counter to a man who was counting singles with a shaking hand. $3. The plate cost more than $3. She did not wait for him to finish counting. She rang the rest to her own tab, the way you close a drawer, and turned around to wipe the counter. And she set a second fork down beside his plate before she walked away. 2 forks. For one man eating alone. The man in the Suburban did not see her face. He saw the forks. And 40 years of a life he had built from nothing folded shut on that one small thing, because 15 years ago, 3 blocks from here, at a bus counter with $4 to his name, a woman had fed him and set his fork down exactly the same way. His name was Elias Boyd. Boyd Freight moved 11% of the containerized cargo on the Gulf, and he was worth a little over $3 billion, and he had spent a decade and a half unable to find one woman to say one thing to. He had never known her name. He had only known the 2 forks. She still had no idea he existed. That was the part that would take the longest to fix. The morning of the motorcade, Renata Coles had $61.40 in her account, and she knew it to the dime because she had checked it twice on the walk to the bus. She was 34. She had been on her feet at the blue plate since before it was called the blue plate, since it was Ruth's counter and Renata was a girl doing homework in the last booth, while her grandmother ran the griddle. Now the counter was hers to run and the paycheck was not hers to fix. $427 a week after they cut her Thursdays. Rent was $11.50 on the 1-bedroom on Desland. Marcus needed his inhaler refilled, and the refill was $58, and $58 was a real number when the whole account was $61. She did the math the way she always did it. Rent, then the inhaler, then the payment plan on Marcus's dental surgery, which still had $2,340 left on it and would have that same number on it for a long time. The groceries came out of whatever was standing after that. Usually nothing was standing after that. She did not think of this as hardship. She thought of it as arithmetic. There is a difference, and the difference was Ruth. The bus was the 88, and it came at 6:14 if it came, and she stood at the stop on St. Claude, with her apron already tied under her coat, because tying it at the stop saved 90 seconds at the other end, and 90 seconds was the difference between starting the coffee and starting the coffee late. She had this time to the minute. She had most things timed to the minute. A woman who has never once been late to a shift in 4 years learns that the clock is the only thing in her life that keeps its promises, so she keeps hers back. At the diner, she flipped the sign, started the urn, cut the lights on over the counter, and pulled the ticket rail down. The morning regulars came the way they always came. Mr. Antoine, who took his eggs hard and his coffee harder and left 2 quarters on the counter every single day, not as a tip, he said, but as a deposit on tomorrow. The 2 dispatchers off the overnight who split 1 order of grits and argued about football. A woman named Deborah who came in Tuesdays and Fridays and never Wednesdays, and Renata had never asked why, because you do not ask a person why they can only afford breakfast twice a week. You just set the plate down and turn around. She worked the counter like a person playing an instrument she had stopped needing to look at. Refill without being asked. The check turned face down. The second fork, always the second fork, on every plate that came to a person eating alone, because her hands had been taught that before her mind had a vote. And she did her math on the back of a guest check between the breakfast rush and the 10 o'clock lull the way she did it every morning, in pencil, in a column. Rent, $11.50. Inhaler, $58. Payment plan, the minimum, $140. Bus, $44 a month. Light bill she was already behind on. She added it twice because the first sum always looked like a mistake, and it was never a mistake, and the number at the bottom was a number that did not leave room for the number above it. She erased it. She did not throw the check away. She turned it over and set it under the register. The way you set down something you are not done arguing with. That was Renata's world at 9:40, on a Tuesday, 3 blocks in a lifetime from a man in a black car who was about to walk into it. She had no idea he was coming. She would not have slowed down if she had. There was coffee to start and a fork to set and a boy at home who needed his lungs to work, and none of that waited for anybody, billionaire or otherwise. Ruth Coles had run that counter for 31 years, and she had a rule about hungry men. You feed them. You do not wait to see if they thank you. You turn around and you wipe the counter, because a man who has to watch you watch him eat is a man you have charged twice, once for the food and once for the looking. Ruth used to say it with a rag already in her hand. She said it so many times that Renata stopped hearing it as advice and started hearing it as the sound the diner made. And the fork. Always the second fork. Ruth set 2 forks for a man eating alone every time, and when Renata was 9 and finally asked why, Ruth did not stop wiping. So he doesn't have to ask, she said. That was all. So he doesn't have to ask. Renata had set the second fork every day for 20 years without deciding to. Her hands did it before her mind arrived. It was the one thing she had that the schedule could not cut. Her son did it too in his way. Marcus was 9. He was quiet the way careful children are quiet, and he drew. He drew one thing, over and over, on the backs of receipts and on the corners of his homework, and once on the inside cover of a library book, which had cost them $4 they did not have. He drew a plate, and on the plate 2 forks. Never any food. Just the plate and the 2 forks, side by side, the way he had watched his mother set them since before he could reach the counter. Renata kept the receipts. She did not tell him she kept them. She kept them folded in a coffee tin on top of the refrigerator, next to the payment plan paperwork, and if you had asked her why, she would not have had an answer. Only that some things you keep and you do not weigh them first. That morning Marcus drew one at the kitchen table while she counted out his inhaler money, and she looked at the plate with its 2 forks and had to turn to the sink so he would not see her face. She wiped a counter that was already clean. She had learned that from Ruth too. The inhaler was its own small war. The refill was $58 with the discount card, and $190 without it, and the card was a coupon a pharmacy tech named Ronaldo Doe had printed for her off a website 8 months ago, and told her to keep using until it stopped working. It had not stopped working yet. Every month she slid it across the counter at the Walgreens on St. Claude, and every month she held her breath until the register took it, because the day it did not take it was a day Marcus breathed on whatever was left in the old canister. And the old canister was a thing she shook and listened to the way other people check a gas gauge. She had counted the doses once. There were 200 in a canister, and he needed 2 a day on a good week and more on a bad one. And she had done that arithmetic too, and then made herself stop, because there are sums a mother does not need to finish to know the answer to. She kept a spare in her apron. She kept a spare in the coffee tin. She kept a spare in the drawer by the door. 3 canisters for 1 9-year-old's lungs, and it was not enough spare. It would never feel like enough spare, and she did not call that fear. She called it inventory. Marcus knew none of the numbers. That was the job. He knew that his mother's apron smelled like the griddle and that she brought home the pie that did not sell. And he knew that on Sundays she made him grits the way her grandmother had, and he drew his plate with its 2 forks and asked her once, only once, who the second fork was for. Anybody who's hungry, she told him. He thought about that the way he thought about everything, slowly, all the way down. Then he added a second fork to the drawing he was already working on, so that plate had 4, and he said that way 2 people who were hungry could both not have to ask. She had to leave the room for that one. She stood in the hall outside his door and pressed the heel of her hand flat against the wall and breathed until it passed, and then she came back in and told him it was bedtime, and she did not wipe her face until the light was off. 3 blocks away and 15 years back, a man had gotten off a Greyhound at the Old Saint. Claude Depot with $4 and no plan for the 5th. His name then was Eli. Not Eliot, not by a decade. He had lost his rig to a lien and his commercial license to a violation that was half his fault and half a dispatcher's. And he had ridden a bus into a city where he knew no one because staying where he was known had become the thing he could not do. He was 40 pounds heavier than the trucker who had started the year and 40 pounds lighter than the man who would finish it. He had not eaten since Mobile. He had in his pocket an accounting of himself. He was a man who accounted for things. It was the only skill the trucking had left him with that anyone would ever pay for again. $4.11. A phone with a cracked screen and a balance that would go dead in 6 days. A duffel with 2 shirts, 1 pair of boots that were not the ones on his feet, a folder of paperwork about the rig he no longer had, and a photograph he did not take out anymore. That was the estate of Eli, 41 years old. In the winter he lost everything. He could have told you the value of all of it to the dollar. He had already done the sum a dozen times on the bus. The sum was not enough to matter and too much to throw away, which is the exact weight a man carries when he is deciding whether he is done. There was a counter next to the depot. He went in because it was warm and because $4 buys coffee, and coffee at least you are allowed to sit with. He sat at the end where the light was worst, because a man in his condition learns to pick the seat where he will be looked at least. He put his $4.11 on the counter, so there would be no misunderstanding about what he could pay for. He ordered coffee and nothing else, and he meant to make it last an hour. A woman brought him more than coffee. He had not ordered it. He tried to tell her he only had $4, and she was already gone, already turned back to the griddle, already wiping something down, and when he looked at the plate she had left him, there were 2 forks on it, 1 man eating alone and 2 forks. He remembered thinking, in the flat, exhausted way you think when you are done, that she had made a mistake, that she would come back for the second fork. She did not come back for the second fork. She did not come back to watch him eat at all. She left him alone with a hot plate and his own dignity, which was the first time in 4 months anyone had let him keep both at once. He never learned her name. The next morning he was gone, west, toward the freight yards in Houston, where a man with no license could still load other men's trucks. And it was 7 years before he owned 1 truck and 11 before he owned the yard, and 15 before 3 black Suburbans would carry him back down a street he had spent his whole life not letting himself remember. 2 became a route. A route became a fleet. The fleet became Boyd Freight, and Boyd Freight became a name people in this business said carefully. But he had built all of it around a debt he could not repay because he could not find the person he owed. A gift you keep score on is a loan. He knew that. He had built an empire on money that moved in careful measured columns. Every dollar accounted for, every margin known to the basis point, every truck a line and every mile a cost, and every quarter a promise. He had never once broken to a bank or a board or a shipper. And the one transaction that had actually changed his life, the single entry that outweighed every contract and every acquisition and every dollar the columns had ever carried, was a plate of food he never paid for, handed over by a woman who turned around before she could be thanked, and forgotten by everyone who had been standing in that diner that night, except the one man she had fed. He kept a clean ledger. That was the thing people said about him. Boyd pays. Boyd remembers. Boyd does not leave a line open. But there was a line open. There had always been a line open. 1 meal. No name. 15 years. You cannot pay back a gift that was handed over and forgotten. You can only hand one over yourself. He knew that too. He had funded shelters. He had bought coats by the pallet. He had done all of it, and none of it had closed the line, because charity you sign off on is still a transaction, and the thing he owed had not been a transaction. It had been a woman turning around so he could keep his dignity. You do not repay that with a check. You repay it in kind or you do not repay it at all. Now his car was stopped outside a diner on Delary Street, and a woman inside had just set down 2 forks. And Elias Boyd, who had spent 15 years unable to close 1 line in his own book, put his hand on the door. The schedule for the next 2 weeks went up on the wall by the walk-in at 9:52, and Renata found her name on it at 9:58, and by 10:01 she had counted her hours twice and gotten the same wrong answer both times. 22 hours. She was down to 22 hours a week. She stood in front of the taped-up sheet with a plate in each hand, and read it the way you read a thing you already understand and are hoping to misunderstand. Monday off. Wednesday off. Thursday, which had already been cut once, cut again to a half. Her name, which for 9 years had anchored the top of the morning column, had been slid down and thinned out until it barely held a paycheck. Somebody had done this on purpose. Schedules do not thin by accident. Somebody had sat with the sheet and moved her. On purpose. With a pencil. The somebody had a name, and the name was new, and the name was Carla. Carla Moe had been the general manager for 6 weeks. She was 40, and she had come over from the location on Claiborne when the whole group changed hands, and she had the look of a woman who checks her own rearview mirror more than the road ahead. She was not cruel. That mattered, and it would keep mattering. She did not thin Renata's hours because she disliked Renata. She thinned them because a man named Dwight Forey had handed her a spreadsheet with a red line on it, and told her that everyone whose name sat above that red line had to come down below it by the end of the month, and that the managers who could not make their labor numbers were the next names to move. Carla had a mortgage on a shotgun double on Piety, and a daughter starting at Delgado in the fall, and an ex who was 4 months behind. That was the math Carla did. Whether it was the right math was a question only Carla could answer, and she had not answered it. She had only run the numbers Forey gave her and moved the names he told her to move, and she had gotten good at not looking up from the sheet while she did it. Dwight Forey came through on Tuesdays. He owned 4 diners now, the Blue Plate, and 3 others he had picked up in the same sale, and he moved between them in a gray sedan with a folder on the passenger seat, and when he came through the Blue Plate, he did not eat. That was the first thing Renata had noticed about him. A man had bought the counter her grandmother built, and he would not sit at it. He walked the floor with the folder open against his forearm, and he looked at the room the way you look at a spreadsheet that has grown legs. Covers per hour. Labor as a % of sales. The 2 dispatchers splitting 1 order of grits were, to Dwight Forey, a line that was slightly too long for the revenue it generated. He was 47. He was not a monster, and it would have been easier if he were. He had a way of being pleasant that cost him nothing and told you nothing. He called the staff by name. He had learned everyone's name specifically, so that thinning their hours would feel, to him, like a decision made about people rather than to them. He told Carla the targets and he let Carla hold the line. That was the cleanest part of the whole arrangement. It meant that on the day Renata's hours vanished, the man who vanished them was 40 miles away at the Metairie location, being pleasant to someone else. Clean hands. That was the product he had actually bought. He stopped at the counter that Tuesday only long enough to tell Renata the grits were moving slow and to ask, lightly, whether they really needed the second fork on the singles, whether that wasn't a little extra silverware to wash for no ticket. He said it like a joke. He was not joking. He was a man who had found on a walk through a diner 1 line item worth exactly 1 fork's worth of dish soap and had made a note of it. Renata said the forks came with the counter. She did not explain it. He did not ask her to. He wrote nothing down about the forks, but she watched him decide not to write it down, and she understood that this was a man who had already written down everything else. When Renata came to the little office by the dry storage and set the schedule on the desk and asked, plainly, what happened to her hours, Carla did not look up either. Corporate set the labor target, she said. I'm just holding the line. Renata waited. She was good at waiting. The counter had taught her that a silence is a tool. Carla filled it, the way people who are holding a line always do. She said the numbers came from above her. She said she had no say in the target, only in who absorbed it. She said she was sorry, and she said it to the desk. She said Renata was one of the best people she had, and that this was not personal, and that if anything opened up she would be first. And each thing she said was a little truer than the last, and none of it put an hour back on the wall. Renata picked up the schedule. She looked at it one more time. Then she said the only thing she came to say. I've never been late. Not once in 9 years. And she set the paper down and went back to the counter, because the coffee did not care whose hours had been cut, and the second fork still had to go down on the 10:30 plate. Here is the part the schedule does not show you. Renata had been at the Blue Plate for 9 years, which under the group's own benefits plan meant she was 14 months from vesting, from the point where the little retirement match the company advertised in the break room actually became hers to keep. That was not an accident of the calendar. Forey knew the vesting dates. Everyone above the red line was close to 1. That was how the line had been drawn. Cut a person to 22 hours and 2 things happen, both useful to a man like Forey. She drops below the threshold where the company owes her the match. And she starts looking for a second job on her own, and eventually the schedule solves itself. And no one ever has to write the word fired because nobody fired her. Her hours just went away until she did. This is not a story about one bad manager. This is where the story stops being about the Blue Plate for a minute, because what happened to Renata's name on that wall happens to a great many names, and it has a name of its own. They call it just-in-time scheduling. On-call shifts. Hours set a week or less in advance. Workers sent home early when the covers are slow, kept below the line that would trigger benefits or overtime. Millions of hourly workers in America live inside a schedule they cannot see coming. A shift posted days before it starts, or canceled hours before it does, so that a person cannot hold a second job, cannot arrange steady childcare, cannot plan a single week with certainty. Researchers who study it have a phrase for what it does to a household. It moves the risk of a slow Tuesday off the company's books and onto the kitchen table of the person who was counting on that Tuesday. The paycheck becomes a number nobody can predict, set by someone the worker will never meet. And the not knowing is not a side effect. It is the design. For the people drawing the schedule, the not knowing is the point. Renata did not have the phrase for it. She did not need the phrase. She had 22 hours and a wall to read them off of. That night she did the new math at the kitchen table after Marcus was down. 22 hours at the counter. Call it $290 a week now after. Rent $11.50. That was 4 weeks of pay right there almost. The inhaler $58. The payment plan $140, and if she skipped it they added a fee and the fee had a fee. The light bill she was already carrying. She wrote it in the column. She added it twice. The second sum matched the first, which was the wrong kind of good news, because it meant the number was real. The number was short. Not a little short. Short the way a bridge is short when it does not reach the other side. She sat with it. She did not cry over it. Crying was a thing she did at the sink over a fork drawing, not at the table over arithmetic, because arithmetic you can do something about and grief you cannot. She looked at what she could move. She could pick up a second job, nights, which meant leaving Marcus with Miss Odette down the block, which cost money, which went back in the column and made the number shorter. She could drop the payment plan and eat the fees. She could call the light company and buy 2 weeks with a promise. She circled the second job. She underlined the light company. She did not circle the inhaler ever, and she did not circle rent, because those two were not numbers. Those two were the walls the rest of the numbers lived inside. Then she folded the paper into the coffee tin with the receipts and the payment plan paperwork and Marcus's drawings, and she went to bed because she had a half shift in the morning and she had never been late. The regulars found out the way regulars find out, which is by noticing who is not behind the counter on a day they expected her. Mr. Antoine came in Wednesday, which was one of her new days off, and stood a moment when a younger server he did not know brought his eggs. He ate them. He left his 2 quarters. But on Thursday, when Renata was back for her half shift, he waved her over and pushed something across the counter under his hand the way men his age push things, folded small, not to be discussed. It was 2 20s. He told her it was not charity. He told her it was the deposit he'd been leaving her every morning for 6 years, finally come due. He told her he had no children and a pension that outran his appetite, and that a man ought to be allowed to spend his own money on his own counter. He was building her a whole doorway to walk through so she would not have to call it what it was. Renata put her hand flat on the 2 20s and slid them back. She did it gently. She did it the way Ruth would have. She told him the deposit system only worked one direction. His quarters bought tomorrow. Hers bought his coffee. That was the trade, and it was a good trade, and she was not going to be the one to break it. She told him she was fine. She was not fine. He knew she was not fine. She knew he knew. And she slid the money back anyway, because there is a kind of person who will take a cut to 22 hours before she will take $40 she did not earn, and Ruth had raised that kind of person on purpose. You feed people, Mr. Antoine, she said. You don't pay them to let you. He put the 220s back in his pocket. He did not push again. But he sat at that counter for another hour, longer than his coffee, longer than his paper, and he watched her work the way you watch something you have decided to keep an eye on. He was not the only one keeping an eye on it. Deborah, who came Tuesdays and Fridays and never Wednesdays, had watched the whole thing from her booth over a plate she made last as long as Renata's did. She did not have 220s to slide. She had a church, though, and the church had a pantry, and on her way out she stopped at the counter and did not offer money, because she knew better than Mr. Antoine did. She just said the pantry on Desland ran Saturdays, no questions, no sign-in, and that a person could send a neighbor's boy to carry a bag home so it did not have to be her own hands that took it. She said it fast and low, and then she was gone before Renata could slide anything back, because Deborah understood the one rule Mr. Antoine kept forgetting. You do not hand a proud woman charity. You hand her a door and let her decide to walk through it, and you are already gone by the time she looks up. Renata looked up. Deborah was gone. On the counter where her plate had been, 2 quarters, and beside them, though no one had ordered it and no one was sitting there, a second fork Renata's own hand had set down out of habit an hour before and never cleared. She looked at the fork a long moment. Then she wiped the counter and went back to work. The next man who came in hungry and short did not get slid back anything. He came in near close, a thin man in a canvas jacket with the collar up, and he ordered the cheapest thing on the board, and then tried to make it cheaper, and Renata watched him count and knew the count before he finished it. She did not wait for him to come up short out loud. She put the plate down. She rang the difference to her own tab quiet, the way you close a drawer, and she set the second fork. 22 hours on the wall behind her and $61 in her account, and a boy at home shaking a canister to hear how much was left in it, and she set the second fork down beside a stranger's plate, because her hands had been taught to before the schedule was ever posted, and no red line Dwight Forey could draw reached all the way down to that. The man ate. She turned around and wiped a counter that was already clean. She did not see the black Suburban still parked across Delary, or the man in the back of it who had not left, who had watched the whole thing through the window. The schedule read off the wall, the 220s slid back, the plate put down, the second fork. She did not see him at all. But he had seen the fork. Again. And a man who had spent 15 years unable to close one line in his own book sat very still in a car worth more than the building, and understood that he had found her, and that finding her was going to be the easy part. Elias Boyd did not walk in that morning. He did not go through the door of the blue plate. He did something that for him was harder. He drove away and sent someone else in. The someone else was a woman named Priya Desai. She had run his chief of staff's office for 9 years. She had learned in the first of them that when Elias Boyd went quiet and still, you did not fill the quiet. You waited it out. Then you did exactly what he asked, because what he asked was never idle. He asked her, from the back of the Suburban 3 blocks after they pulled away from Delary, to find out everything about that diner. Not the numbers. He had people for numbers. He wanted the story. Who ran the counter? How long? Who ran it before them? And, he said, and here Priya looked up from her phone, because his voice had changed. He wanted the name of the woman working the counter that morning. He wanted it before the groundbreaking. Priya had booked his rooms and buried his mistakes and sat across from men who moved cities around. She had never once heard him ask for a waitress's name, like it was the only line item that had ever mattered. She got it in an hour. It did not take a private investigator. It took 2 cups of coffee and a willingness to sit at a counter and listen, which in the lower ninth is not a hard thing to be offered. She went in at the mid-morning lull, out of the suit, in a cardigan she kept in the car for exactly this kind of errand. She ordered coffee and pie, and she did the thing her job had taught her, which was to be a little lost and a little friendly and in no hurry at all. The pie was sweet potato, and it was, she would tell Elias later, genuinely very good, and she said so to the older man 2 stools down, and that was the whole key that opened the whole door. Mr. Antoine did not need much encouragement to talk about the counter. Men who have decided to keep an eye on something like to know that someone else has noticed it too. He told her about the pie. The recipe came down from the grandmother. He told her the grandmother had run the counter 31 years. He told her, without being asked, that they were cutting Nay's hours, and that it was a shame and a sin, and that he had tried to do something about it, and been told no in the politest way a person can be told no. He told her about the forks before Priya even knew to ask about forks, because to Mr. Antoine the forks were not local color, they were the entire point of the place, the thing that made it Ruth's counter, and not just a counter that used to be Ruth's. Priya paid for her pie and left a tip that was careful not to be strange, and she sat in her car and wrote it all down, and she underlined one line twice without quite knowing why she was underlining it. The granddaughter still sets 2 forks. Her name is Renata Coles. Everybody calls her Nay. The counter, Priya learned, had been Ruth's. Ruth Coles had run it for 31 years, back when it sat beside the old St. Claude bus depot before the depot closed. Then the diner moved 4 blocks over to Delary and took its name and its griddle and its rules with it. Ruth had passed 3 years ago. The counter went to her granddaughter, the girl who had grown up doing homework in the back booth, and she ran it now exactly the way Ruth had, down to the forks. The forks. Priya almost did not mention the forks in her report. It seemed like the kind of local color that wastes a principal's time. She mentioned them anyway. She was thorough. The old woman used to set 2 forks for any man eating alone, she wrote, so he wouldn't have to ask. The granddaughter still does it. Her name is Renata Coles. Everybody calls her Nay. Elias read the report in the back of the car outside the groundbreaking site, in the 90 seconds before he had to get out and hold a gold shovel and smile for a photograph, and he read the part about the depot twice, and then he set the phone face down on his knee and looked out the window at nothing for the rest of the 90 seconds. Then a man in a hard hat opened his door and the 90 seconds were over. He got out. He held the shovel. He turned the ceremonial dirt for the cameras and shook the mayor's hand and said the words a man says at a groundbreaking about jobs and investment and belief in a neighborhood, and the whole time some back part of him was 3 blocks away at a counter doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with the hub. He was good at this. He had learned to run 2 ledgers at once a long time ago. The one people could see always balanced. It was the other one that had carried a debt for 15 years. The depot. The diner had been beside the depot. 15 years ago he had gotten off a bus at the St. Claude Depot with $4.11, and he had walked into the warm place next door, because coffee is a thing you are allowed to sit with, and a woman had fed him and set 2 forks and turned around so he could keep his dignity while he ate. It had been Ruth. The woman who saved him had been this woman's grandmother. In the very counter this woman now ran, 3 blocks from where the bus had let him off. He had spent 15 years unable to find the diner, because the diner had moved and changed its cross street. And the woman who fed him was 3 years in the ground. The debt he could not close had been closed at one end the whole time, by a death he never knew about. And it was left open at the other end by a granddaughter who set the same forks, and had no idea she had inherited a stranger's whole life along with the griddle. That night Elias told Priya the story. All of it. He had never told anyone all of it. He told her about the lien and the license and the bus from Mobile. He told her about the $4.11 laid on the counter, so there would be no misunderstanding about what he could pay for. He told her about the seat in the worst light, where a man in his condition learns to sit. He told her about the plate he did not order. About the woman who was already gone before he could refuse it. About the 2 forks. And he told her about the 15 years. For 15 years he had walked into diners near depots in every city his trucks ran through. He looked at the counter. He looked to see if anyone set 2 forks. No one ever did. He had started to think he had made her up. He had started to think a man that far down invents a mercy because he needs one, and that the forks were a thing his mind built to survive the night. They were not. She was real. She had a name, and the name was Ruth, and Ruth was gone. Then he told Priya the thing he had never said out loud. He did not want to find the woman to thank her. Thanking her would make it a transaction, and it had never been a transaction. He wanted to find her so he could do the same thing she did. Hand something over. Turn around before he could be thanked. That was the only currency that could settle what she had spent on him. A gift you keep score on is a loan. The only thing that ever changes a life is the one handed over and forgotten. He had learned that from her, on a night she forgot the second she wiped the counter, and he had built $3 billion on top of it, and never once been able to spend it the way she spent $4 on a stranger. Priya, who did not cry at work, wrote none of this down. She just listened, and when he was done, she asked him the only useful question. What do you want to do? And Elias, who moved cities around, said the smallest possible thing. He said, I want to see what she does with a little room to breathe, before she knows anyone is watching. I want to know if the forks are real, or if they only come out when the counter is being paid for. So he tested her. Quietly, the way you test a thing you are afraid to be wrong about. He did not send Renata money. He knew from Priya's report, and from 30 seconds of watching through a window, that money handed to a woman like that would be slid right back across the counter the way she had slid back Mr. Antoine's 220s. You cannot give to a proud woman directly. You have to give in a direction she is not guarding. The blue plate owed money. Its produce supplier had not been paid in 2 months. Forey ran the 4 diners lean. He paid the vendors last and slow, the way a man does when he has decided that other people's patience is a line of credit he is entitled to. The produce company had run out of patience. There was a note on the blue plate's account now. The next delivery was cash on arrival or nothing. Priya found this in an afternoon. It was the kind of pressure point Elias had spent his whole career finding. He knew the shape of it before she finished the sentence. A vendor squeezed. A note on an account. A valve somewhere held shut by a man counting pennies that were not his to count. A man named Boyd, whose freight company happened to move that produce company's cold cargo up the whole Gulf, made one call. The note came off the account. The 2 months of debt was quietly marked, paid by an entity 3 shells removed from any name a waitress would ever recognize. No card. No letter. No hand to slide back. Just a hold, lifted, in a direction Renata was not guarding and would never think to look. Then he waited to see what the breathing room did. Here is what it did. The cash on arrival hold lifted, and the Saturday delivery came full for the first time in a month. And Forey's labor targets did not change one bit. The produce relief never reached Renata's paycheck, because that is not how it works. Relief pools at the top. It drips down only where someone opens a valve, and Forey's valve stayed shut, because $1 he did not have to spend on labor was $1 that stayed his. So the diner ate better, and the cook worked the same 22 hours for the same thin check. Renata was still at 22 hours. Renata still had $60-some, and a boy at home shaking a canister. The canister was down to a rattle now. Marcus had learned to hear it the way she did. He did not tell her when it got low, because he had figured out that telling her put a look on her face, and he had decided, at 9, that he would rather breathe carefully than put that look there. He drew instead. That week he drew the plate again, the 2 forks, and this time he drew a third thing beside it that she did not recognize at first, a small rectangle with lines. When she asked, he said it was the inhaler. He had put it on the plate. Because, he said, it was the thing their family could not run out of, and you put the important thing on the plate. She kept that drawing too. She put it in the coffee tin with the others. She did not sleep much that night, and it was not the arithmetic keeping her up. It was a 9-year-old who had drawn his own medicine onto a plate of food and called it the thing they could not run out of. That was the house Elias Boyd was watching from across the street, without knowing the half of what was inside it. He knew the 22 hours. He did not know about the canister. He was about to. That was the lesson, and Elias already knew it. But watching it happen in real time sharpened it into something he could use. You cannot fix a person's life by pouring money into the top of a system built to keep it. The money never falls all the way. Only one thing reaches the bottom. The thing you hand to the bottom directly. Ruth had known that. Ruth had not donated to a fund. Ruth had put a plate in front of a man and turned around. And the thin man in the canvas jacket came back. His name, it turned out, was Theo. He had told her the second time, the way people tell you their name once they have decided you are safe. Theo Wills. 40 maybe. He was between a shelter bed and a cousin's couch and a job that started next week if the next week ever came. The job was at a warehouse out east. It was real. He had the paper for it folded in his jacket, soft at the creases from being taken out and looked at. He showed it to her once, not to prove anything, just because a man who is almost through something wants one person to know he is almost through it. He came in near close again and ordered the cheapest thing on the board. He reached for his pocket. Renata put the plate down before he got there. She rang the difference to her own tab. $61 in the account and 22 hours on the wall, and she set the second fork. Same counter. Same tab. Same fork. Nothing had reached her, so nothing had changed in her. She gave exactly what she had given when she had nothing. That was the answer to the question Elias had asked. It was the answer he was most afraid of. It was also the one he most needed. Because it meant the forks were real. It meant the woman he owed his life to had raised a granddaughter. A granddaughter who would have fed him the same way. On the same night. For the same nothing. Across Delary, a car had come back a second evening. It parked where it could see the window. Elias Boyd watched Theo eat 2 forks on his plate and made a decision. A decision that was going to cost Dwight Forey everything. Everything he had built on the backs of thinned-out schedules. He was not going to hand Renata a check. He was going to hand her back her grandmother's counter. And he was going to do it in a direction she was not guarding. The thing about a groundbreaking is that it moves a map before it moves any dirt. The day Boyd Freight announced a distribution hub 8 blocks off St. Claude, every lease within a mile of it changed value overnight. The men who owned those leases knew it by lunch. A block that had been cheap because nobody was coming was suddenly a block that everybody was coming to. And the blue plate sat on a corner lot that Dwight Forey did not own. He only leased it. He had bought the diners. He had never bought the ground they stood on. That distinction had never cost him anything. It was about to cost him everything. Elias Boyd owned ground for a living. It was the quiet half of the business. The half nobody photographs. Not the trucks. The land the trucks need. The yards, the depots, the corners where a route has to touch down. He knew how to buy a corner. He knew how to buy the company that held the note on a corner. And the note on the blue plate's corner was held by a family trust that was very interested all of a sudden in what Boyd Freight might pay. Elias paid. It was to him a rounding error. It was to the corner everything. He now owned the ground the blue plate stood on. Which meant that when Forey's lease came up for renewal in 11 weeks, the man who decided whether it renewed was no longer a family trust that did not care. It was a man who cared about exactly one thing on that corner. And it was not the rent. That was link 1. Forey did not feel it yet. That is how a cascade works. The first stone moves in a quiet the falling man mistakes for safety. Link 2 walked into it on her own, and her name was Carla. Carla Moe had been holding the line for 6 weeks, and the line had started holding her. She had moved the names Forey told her to move. She had watched Nay Coles drop to 22 hours. Say nothing, but I've never been late. She had gone home to her shotgun double on piety and not slept. And she had told herself the thing everyone in her position tells themselves. That if she did not do it, they would only hire someone who would. It is the oldest sentence in the world. It has excused more quiet harm than any other sentence people say to themselves in the dark, and Carla said it every night, and every night it worked a little less well. Then Priya Desai came to see her. Not at the diner. At a coffee place on the other side of Claiborne. Quiet. No folder on the table. Just 2 women and a question. Priya did not threaten her. That was the part Carla did not expect. She had braced for a threat and gotten a job offer instead. A real one. At a company that was about to need a lot of people who knew how to run a floor. From someone who made it clear the offer stood regardless of what Carla did next. No strings. No trade. And then, only then, Priya asked the question she had come to ask. She asked whether the schedules had been changed to push people below their vesting dates on purpose. She asked whether there was a record. There was a record. Carla had kept it. The way a person keeps a receipt they cannot explain keeping. Every version of every schedule Fori had told her to redraw. The original, with Nay anchoring the morning column. The redraw with Nay slid down to 22. The email that said bring everyone above the red line down by month end. She had saved all of it in a folder on her own account. She had told herself she saved it to protect herself. And maybe that was true. But a person who is only protecting herself does not keep the original schedules. The ones that show what a fair week looked like before she made it unfair. You only keep those if some part of you is keeping evidence for the people you are hurting, against the day someone finally asks. Carla gave Priya the folder. Then she said the thing she had not let herself say in 6 weeks. I did the math for my house. I never once did it for theirs. She was not cruel. She had never been cruel. She was a woman one warning away from losing her own footing, who had been handed a red line and told to draw it through other people. And she had drawn it. And she had known the whole time it was wrong. Known the whole time is the part that does not wash out. Whether it was the right math was a question only Carla could answer. She had just answered it. It had taken her 6 weeks and a folder of schedules, and a stranger who offered her a door before she reached for the ledger. But she had answered it. Here is what the folder proved, and here is why it mattered beyond one diner. What Fori did has a name. The name is wage theft. Most people think it means a boss reaching into a register. It rarely looks like that. It looks like a schedule redrawn to keep hours below the line that triggers overtime. It looks like clockouts edited after the fact. It looks like a vesting date quietly outrun by a cut no one will put in writing as a firing. It is one of the largest forms of theft in the country by dollar value, and almost none of it is ever charged as theft, because it wears a spreadsheet instead of a mask. Studies that try to measure it keep arriving at the same uncomfortable size. Low-wage workers lose billions of dollars a year to hours they worked and were not paid for, to overtime withheld, to minimums quietly undercut. By some estimates, the total taken this way each year runs larger than all the money lost in every robbery in the country combined. The convenience stores, the gas stations, the banks, all of it, put together and outweighed by what disappears off pay stubs one redrawn shift at a time. The money does not vanish. It moves. It moves off the worker's check and onto the owner's margin, one schedule at a time. And it moves so quietly that the worker often cannot prove it happened, because the only record is the one the owner controls. Except this time the owner did not control the record. Carla did. And Carla had just handed it to the one person in Louisiana with the resources to make it expensive. The last loop closed itself, and it walked in wearing a canvas jacket. Theo Wills started his warehouse job the week he said he would. It was real the way he had said it was real. He learned the racks. He learned the scanner. He learned the particular ache of a body coming back to work after a long time away from it, which is a good ache, the kind you would not trade. Then his first Friday came with a check in his name. He came back to the blue plate. Not short this time. Not counting singles. He came to sit at the counter and order the second cheapest thing instead of the cheapest, which for a man like Theo is the whole distance between two lives. He ordered it like it was nothing. He had practiced ordering it like it was nothing. Renata brought it and did not make a thing of it because she understood exactly what it cost him to have it not be a thing. And that is a kind of grace too, the grace of letting a man's good day be ordinary. Priya was there. She had started coming in quietly, a regular now in her cardigan. And Theo, who did not know who she worked for, told her the story the way a man tells a thing he needs someone to know. He told her about the nights he came in with $3. About how the waitress put the plate down before he could be embarrassed. About how she rang the rest to her own tab and never once let him see her do it. He told her about the second fork. He said he did not know why the second fork undid him more than the food. Only that it did. A woman with 22 hours on the wall behind her set a second fork for a man who had nobody to eat with. so that eating alone would at least look like company. He said he had eaten in a lot of places on his way down, and been looked at in all of them, and this was the only counter where a person had gone out of her way to make sure he did not have to be looked at all. Priya wrote it down. Not for a case. For Elias. Because the man she worked for had asked her one question 15 years in the making. Is she real? And here was a stranger in a canvas jacket answering it a third time on the record without being asked. The forks were real. They had always been real. Every test Elias had run came back the same, and the sameness was the answer. Fori found out he was falling on a Tuesday, which was the day he came through. But before that Tuesday, one thing has to be said plainly, because it is the whole shape of the story. Renata knew none of this. While a corner was being bought and a folder was changing hands and a 15-year debt was quietly arranging its own repayment, Renata Coles was working 22 hours and worrying about a canister. She did not know Priya worked for anyone. She thought Priya was a woman who liked the sweet potato pie, had good manners, and tipped like she meant it. She noticed the shelves came fuller now. The Saturday produced full for the first time in a month, and she was glad of it the way you are glad of small mercies. She did not spend 1 second wondering why. A woman with her arithmetic does not have seconds to spend wondering why a good thing happened. You take the good thing. You do not audit it. Auditing a mercy is how you talk yourself out of it. She kept setting the second fork. That was the only ledger she was keeping. 22 hours on the wall. $60-some in the account. A boy at home with a rattling canister. And a second fork on every plate that went to a person eating alone, because that was the counter her grandmother built, and she was not going to be the one it stopped with. She had no idea she was being watched. She had no idea she was being tested. She had no idea she had already passed, 3 times over without knowing there was a test, which is the only way that particular test can ever be passed. That was the woman at the center of all of it. And she was the last to know any of it was happening. He came in with his folder against his forearm. Pleasant as ever. He found Priya Desai at the counter. He found a man he did not know standing near the register. And he found out 3 things in the space of 10 minutes that rearranged the rest of his life. He found out that the ground under his diner had been bought. He found out that his own general manager had turned over 11 weeks of redrawn schedules to a freight company's counsel. And he found out, this was the one that changed his face, that the freight company was not interested in a settlement. It was interested in the lease. All 4 leases as it happened. Because a man who owns one corner can find the notes on the others. And Boyd had found them. Everyone. Fori did the thing men like Fori do. He got pleasant harder. He talked about labor targets, about market rates, about how everyone in the industry ran schedules this way, about how none of it was personal, it was numbers, just numbers. He was still saying it was just numbers when Priya slid 1 sheet across the counter to him. It was the email. Bring everyone above the red line down by month end. His own words. About people. In writing. He stopped saying it was just numbers. He had spent his whole career making sure the cut never had his name on it. It was always Carla's hand on the schedule. Always a target from corporate. Always clean hands 40 miles away, being pleasant to someone else. And the one time he put it in his own words, he put it in an email. Because he had believed, the way men who never fall believe, that no one below the red line would ever be the one holding the pen. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about it for 11 weeks and had not known, and the not knowing had felt exactly like safety, which is the only thing not knowing ever feels like. The cascade had reached him. He could feel it now. And the thing that was going to take everything from him was not a lawsuit, and not the lease, and not even the email. It was hours. The hours he had stolen a dozen at a time from people 14 months from vesting, the hours he had slid off their checks and onto his margin and told himself were only numbers. The hours a woman named Carla had quietly saved every version of in a folder she could not explain keeping had been adding themselves up in the dark this entire time, waiting with the patience only stolen things have for the day someone would finally make him give them back. Those hours were the bill now. And it was due. Across the river in an office he almost never used, Elias Boyd read Priya's report on Theo, and the transcript of Forey in the diner, and the folder of schedules, and he did not smile. This was not the part that mattered to him. Taking a man's corner is easy when you own corners for a living. He set the folder down and looked out at nothing, the way he had outside the groundbreaking, because the part that mattered was still ahead of him, and it did not involve Forey at all. It involved a counter, and a woman who still did not know his name, and 2 forks he was finally going to be allowed to set down himself. The motorcade came back to Delary Street on a Thursday, and this time the man in the middle car got out. He came in alone. He told the suburbans to wait down the block out of sight. A man does not walk into the last thing he has waited 15 years for with 2 other cars announcing him. He came in wearing a coat worth more than the diner's monthly rent. He sat at the counter like anyone, in the seat where the light was worst. He had not chosen it on purpose. He did not notice he had chosen it. Because some part of a man remembers where he learned to sit, even after he never has to sit there again. Renata came down the counter, pot in hand. She did not know him. Why would she? To her, he was a well-dressed man who had wandered in off a block that was changing. One more sign that the neighborhood was turning into something that would not have room for a diner much longer. She turned his cup and poured and asked if he wanted to see a menu. He said just the coffee. And then he said, could he ask her something? And she said people usually did. He asked her why she set 2 forks. She had been asked before, over the years, by people who thought it was a quirk. She gave them the short answer, the one that closed the subject. My grandmother did it. She started to give him the short answer. She stopped. Then she stopped because of how he had asked it. He had not asked it like a quirk. He had asked it like a man confirming something he already knew, the way you ask someone to say a name you have carried so long you need to hear it in another mouth to believe it is real. So she gave him the long one. She told him about Ruth and the counter by the depot and the rule. You feed a hungry man and you turn around and wipe the counter, so he never has to watch you watch him eat. And the second fork, always, so a man eating alone would not have to ask for company, would not have to be alone at the one table where someone had decided he would not be. She said her grandmother had done it for 31 years, and she had done it for 9, and she would do it until the counter closed, which the way the block was going might be sooner than she wanted. The man at the counter had put his coffee down somewhere in the middle of it. He had not picked it back up. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he reached past his own cup, and he took the clean fork from the setting to his left, and he laid it down beside his own, so that there were 2 forks in front of him, one man, eating alone. And he said she set them like this. 15 years ago. At the counter by the St. Claude Depot. For a man who came in off a bus with $4 and no plan for the 5th. Renata went very still. He told her the rest with his hands folded on the counter, not looking for sympathy, not performing it, just setting it down the way you set down a thing you have carried too far to keep carrying. He told her he had been that man. Eli then. 41 and finished. A lien where his truck used to be. A bus ticket he could barely afford. He had ridden into a city where he knew no one, because staying where he was known had become the thing he could not do. He told her about the $4.11. He had laid them on that counter so there would be no misunderstanding about what he could pay for. And a woman had brought him a plate he did not order. She had turned around before he could refuse it. She had left 2 forks on it. She had never come back to watch him eat. He told her he had not learned the woman's name. He told her about the 15 years. Every city his trucks ran through, he had walked into the diners near the depots. He had looked at the counters. He had looked for 2 forks. He never found them. He had started to believe he invented her, because a man that far down needs to invent a mercy to survive the night. He told her the woman had been her grandmother, that the counter had been this counter, moved 4 blocks and renamed. He told her about 3 weeks ago. He had gotten out of a car on a street he had spent his whole life not letting himself remember. He had looked through that window. He had seen a woman set 2 forks for a stranger who could not pay. And he had known, before he knew anything else, that he had finally found the place. that the woman who saved him was gone, and that she had left the forks to someone. Then he said the thing he had come to say. The thing 15 years and $3 billion had been unable to say until now, because there had been no one to say it to. You didn't feed me because I was somebody. You fed me when I was nobody. That is the only reason I am anybody now. And I have spent 15 years trying to find the woman who did it, and she is gone, so I came to find you, not to pay you back, because you cannot pay this back. I have tried every way money knows, and it does not reach. I came so that someone would finally see you do it. Because your grandmother turned around every single time, so no one would ever watch her. And somebody should have been watching. Somebody should have seen. I saw. I see you. Here is the thing the second fork had always been, that neither of them had ever said out loud, that Ruth had known and never explained, and Renata had done 10,000 times without deciding to. The second fork was never really for the stranger. A stranger can eat with one fork. A stranger who is handed a plate and left alone does not need a second piece of silverware to be fed. The second fork was so the person who gave could not simply give and vanish. So the plate set that way always held a place for one more. And the one more was the giver herself, pulled back to the table she was trying to turn away from. Ruth set 2 forks so that giving would never become a thing she did from above. At a distance, a coin dropped and forgotten. 2 forks meant sit down. 2 forks meant you are in this too. 2 forks meant the person you fed and the person who fed him are at the same table, the same height, eating the same meal. Renata had spent her whole life setting the second fork for everyone else. She had never once understood that her grandmother had also been setting it for her. The rule was not only how you feed a stranger. It was how you make sure the giver is never left standing alone on the other side of her own kindness. The second fork was hers all along, and a billionaire had come 15 years to sit down at it. She did not cry the way people cry in the moment they are seen. She cried the way you cry when someone hands you back a thing you did not know you had lost. She put her hand flat on the counter the way she had put it on Mr. Antoine's 220s, except this time she was not sliding anything back because you cannot slide back being seen. It does not have a form you can return. Marcus was in the back booth doing homework the way she had done at his age. He had heard some of it. He did not understand most of it. But he understood that the man had made his mother's face do a thing he had only seen it do at the sink. And he did what he did with everything he could not hold any other way. He drew it. A plate. 2 forks. And this time, sitting at the plate, 2 small figures instead of 1, because for the first time in his whole life of drawing that picture, someone had come and sat down at the second fork, and the plate was not a place a person ate alone. The material things came after, the way they are supposed to, in the downslope where they belong. The lease on the blue plate did not renew for Dwight Forey. It renewed for Renata Coles, on the ground Elias Boyd now owned, at a rent set by a man who cared about exactly one thing on that corner, and it was not the rent. The counter her grandmother built came back to the family it belonged to. The produce debt was gone. The cruise hours came back, all of them, above the red line, where they should have been. And the little vesting match that Forey had tried to outrun quietly turned into money that was theirs to keep. Renata did not have 22 hours anymore. She had a counter with her name on the lease, and a boy whose canister she would never again have to shake and listen to. She refused at first. Of course she refused. A woman who slides back 220s does not simply accept a diner. It took Elias saying the only thing that could have moved her, that it was not a gift and not charity and not repayment because none of those reached. It was a fork. He was setting a second fork. He was sitting down at the table she had spent her whole life setting for everyone but herself, and she could no more slide it back than Ruth could have. She kept the counter. She sat down at it, and Dwight Forey lost his. He lost all 4. The leases went one by one. The ground bought out from under each the way the first had been. The schedules Carla had saved became a matter for people whose job it is to count stolen hours. And the hours added up to a number with his name on it at last. The man who had spent his career making sure the cut never had his name on it got a bill that had nothing but his name on it. He had stripped people of their hours to make his margins. The margins had been the only thing holding up everything he owned. When the hours came due, the margins went. When the margins went, the houses those margins had built went with them. He took people's hours. He lost his houses. That was the whole arithmetic, and it balanced the way arithmetic does. Somewhere in America right now, a schedule is being redrawn to keep someone below a line they cannot see, and a single mother is reading her hours off a wall and doing the math that does not reach the bottom of the page, and a child is shaking a canister to hear how much is left, and most of the time no motorcade stops, and most of the time no one is watching, and the giver turns around and wipes the counter and is never once seen doing it. That is not a story. That is just Tuesday. In 10,000 diners. In a country that has a button for eviction and no button for the woman who sets 2 forks. But once on Delary Street, someone stopped the car. Someone came in. Someone took the second fork and laid it down beside his own, and said the words out loud that the giver had spent her whole life making sure no one would ever have to say. I see you. This story is fictional, but the systems it describes are real. There is no blue plate on Delary Street, and there was never a man named Elias Boyd who came back for the woman who fed him. Renata is invented. So is her grandmother and the counter and the 2 forks. The schedule on the wall is not invented. Right now, in this country, millions of people work hours they cannot see coming, shifts posted days before they start or canceled hours before they do, deliberately kept below the line that would trigger overtime or benefits. It has a purpose. It moves the risk of a slow Tuesday off the company's books and onto a worker's kitchen table, and the not knowing is not a flaw in the system. It is the design. And when hours are quietly taken, it has a name. Wage theft. Most people picture a hand in a register. It almost never looks like that. It looks like a schedule redrawn, a clock out edited, a half hour of prep never paid for. Researchers at the Economic Policy Institute found that minimum wage violations alone cost workers around $15 billion a year, more than the total value of every robbery, burglary, and property crime in the country combined. Broader estimates put all wage theft near $50 billion. It is one of the largest forms of theft in America, and almost none of it is ever charged as theft, because it wears a spreadsheet instead of a mask. The people it falls on hardest are already closest to the floor. A tipped worker in this country can legally be paid a cash wage of $2.13 an hour, a federal number that has not moved in over 30 years. The rest is supposed to come from strangers' generosity, counted on to fill a gap the law leaves open on purpose. So the woman who sets the second fork is very often working for $2.13 an hour and giving away a plate she cannot afford, and no one is watching her do it, and that is not a story. That is Tuesday. If you are the one reading your hours off a wall tonight, there are real places to start. Dial 211, free and confidential in most of the country, for help with rent, utilities, and food. If you believe hours or overtime have been stolen from you, the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division investigates wage complaints, and you do not need a lawyer to file one. Local legal aid offices take these cases at no cost. And restaurant worker relief funds exist in most cities for exactly the week the paycheck does not reach the bottom of the page. None of this fixes the thing that needs fixing. But it is a fork set down beside a plate, and sometimes that is the difference between a hard week and a lost one. Here is the thing the whole story was built to say. A gift you keep score on is a loan. The only thing that ever changes a life is the one handed over and forgotten. The plate set down, the counter wiped, the giver turning away before she can be thanked. Most of the people doing that will never have a motorcade stop for them. No one will come back. No one will say the words out loud. So maybe that part is on us. This week, somewhere near you, someone is setting a second fork, feeding a person, covering a tab, carrying a thing quietly so no one has to watch them carry it. You do not need $3 billion to be the one who notices. You just have to look across instead of down and let them know you saw. Set out a second fork for someone this week. And if this story moved you, leave a comment and tell someone what it made you think about, not for the algorithm, for the conversation. Because somebody should be watching. Somebody should see. Let it be you.